2 of our Trail of Tears primary source, a letter written by Private John G. Burnett to his grandkids, basically talking about his regret at being part of the Trail of Tears as a soldier. So where we left off with part 1, Andrew Jackson had been saved by Chief Junaluska during the Creek War. And this was years earlier, before the Trail of Tears, during the War of 1812. So it had been about 20 years earlier. And Andrew Jackson was in danger of being killed by one of the Creeks, and by one of the Creek Indians, and Chief Junaluska of the Cherokee saved him during that battle. So we're going to pick it up with the next paragraph that Private Burnett writes the following. Chief John Ross sent Junaluska as an envoy to plead with President Jackson for protection for his people. But Jackson's manner was cold and indifferent toward the rugged son of the forest, who had saved his life. He met Junaluska, heard his plea, but curtly said to him, "Sir, your audience is ended here. There's nothing I can do for you." The doom of the Cherokee was sealed. Washington, D.C. had decreed that they must be driven west and their lands given to the white man. And in May of 1838, an army of 4,000 regulars and 3,000 volunteer soldiers under the command of General Winfield Scott marched into Indian country and wrote the blackest chapter on the pages of American history. So what we see from this paragraph is that Chief Junaluska was sent to Washington, D.C. to talk to Andrew Jackson and say, "You have to stop this. Don't you remember when I saved your life during the Creek War? How could you repay our tribe by doing something like this?" And the response of Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, was, quote, "Sir, your audience is ended. There's nothing I can do for you." Jackson had forgot that his life was saved by Junaluska. Private Burnett continues, "Men working in the fields were arrested and driven to stockades. Women were dragged from their homes by soldiers whose language they did not understand. Children were often separated from their parents and driven into the stockades, with the sky for a blanket and the earth for a pillow. And often the old and infirm were prodded with bayonets to quicken them to the stockades. In one home, death had come during the night, and a little sad-faced child had died and was lying on a bearskin couch, and some women were preparing the body for burial. All of the women were arrested and driven out, leaving the dead child alone in the cabin. I have no idea what happened or who buried the body." In this paragraph, Private Burnett basically talks about women being unable to bury a child who had died, old folks being driven by the bayonet at the end of a rifle to get onto the wagons to move to the west. He continues, "In another home was a frail mother, apparently a widow, with all 3 small children, one just a baby. When told that she must go, the mother gathered the children at her feet, prayed a humble prayer in her native tongue, patted the old family dog on the head, told the faithful creature goodbye, and with a baby strapped on her back and leading a child with each hand, she started on her exile. But the task proved too great for the frail mother. A stroke of heart failure relieved her of her sufferings. She sunk and died with her baby on her back and her other 2 children clinging to her hands." Chief Junaluska, who had saved President Jackson's life at the Battle of Horseshoe, witnessed this scene, and then with tears gushing down his cheeks, he lifted up his cap and he turned his face towards heaven and said, "My God, if I had known at the Battle of Horseshoe what I know now, American history would have been written differently." In that moment, when Chief Junaluska said that, he was basically saying if he would have known that Andrew Jackson would be this cruel to Native Americans, he would have never saved his life at the Battle of the Horseshoe. Private Burnett goes on, "At this time, 1890, we are too near the removal of the Cherokees for our young people to fully understand the enormity of the crime that was committed against a helpless people. The truth is that facts are being concealed from the young people today. School children of today do not know we are living on the lands that were taken from a helpless race, at the bayonet point to satisfy the white man's greed for gold. Future generations will read and condemn the act, and I do hope posterity will remember the private soldiers like myself and like the 4 Cherokees who were forced by General Scott to shoot an Indian chief and his children had to execute orders of our superiors. We had no choice in the matter. 25 years after the removal, it was my privilege to meet a large company of Cherokees in uniform of the Confederate Army under the command of Colonel Thomas. They were encamped at Zollicoffer. I went to see them. Most of them were just boys at the time of the removal, but they instantly recognized me as, quote, the soldier who was good to us. Being able to talk to them in their native language, I had an enjoyable day with them. From them, I learned that Chief John Ross was still ruler of the nation in 1863, and I wonder if he is still living. He was a noble-hearted fellow and suffered a lot for his race. So, in these couple of paragraphs here, Private Burnett is telling us that, in fact, these several years later, he ran into some Cherokee during the Civil War. So this was about 25 years later. He ran into the Cherokee and had just kind of a great reunion with them and spent the day with them and heard that Chief John Ross was still alive. So he continues on. At one point, Chief John Ross was arrested and thrown into a dirty jail in an effort to break his spirit. But he remained true to his people and led them in prayer when they started on their exile, and his Christian wife sacrificed her life for a little girl who had pneumonia. The Anglo-Saxon race should build a towering monument to perpetuate her noble act in giving her only blanket for comfort of a sick child. Incidentally, the child recovered, but Mrs. Ross is sleeping in an unmarked grave, far from her native Smoky Mountain home. When Scott invaded the Indian country, some of the Cherokees fled to the caves and dens in the mountains and were never captured, and they are there today. I have long intended going there and trying to find them, but I have put off going from year to year, and now I am too feeble and old to ride that far. The fleeting years have come and gone, and old age has overtaken me. I can truthfully say that neither my rifle nor my knife are stained with Cherokee blood. I can truthfully say that I did my best for them when they certainly did need a friend. 25 years after the removal, I still lived in their memory as, quote, the soldier who was good to us. However, murder is murder, whether committed by villain skulking in the dark or by uniformed men stepping to the strains of martial music. Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory. Let the historian of a future day tell the sad story with its sighs, its tears, and its dying groans. Let the great judge of all the earth weigh our actions and reward us according to our work. Children, this ends my promised birthday story, this December 11th, 1890. So what we see in this primary source from Private John Burnett is an account of what happened during the Trail of Tears, a sad account of children separated from their parents, of shallow graves along the side of the road, of people dying from starvation and exposure and hypothermia and pneumonia. And this event, the Trail of Tears, where 4,000 Cherokees died, of 6,000 Cherokees died on this 800-mile journey from their home in southeastern United States to what is modern-day Oklahoma, is something that we need to make sure that we learn about. We need to make sure that we understand it. We need to make sure that we do everything in our power to make sure that something like this can never happen again. So that concludes the reading of the primary source on the Trail of Tears. You now have the information that you need to answer the questions that accompany this video.